Welcome, everyone. Got a big show today. This is CDR episode 70, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being with us. My name is Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. I work on CDR policy advocacy and market development with OpenAir. This is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed. To contextualize them for policy proposals, OpenAir seeks to advance at every level of government in the US, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. If you haven't introduced yourself already, please say hi in the chat. Make sure you're directing that to everyone and not just host and panelists, so everyone can see where who you are and your affiliation and where you're zooming in from. It's really great to have you with us, and we're super excited for today's show. Just some quick background on OpenAir. If you're not familiar, we're all-volunteer global network dedicated to advancing carbon removal. We work together on shared open source missions in the areas of policy, innovation, messaging and communications, and activist market development. Here's a graphical sampling of some of the things that we have going. Our co-founder, Chris Neidl, is running the chat, and he will put a link there to this missions page, as well as to a page where you can fill out a form and sign up to join us. We got a lot of great stuff going on, and we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. One of our really important current hot topics is a bill in California called the California CDR Market Development Act, SB 308. It just passed the California Senate 2 weeks ago, and it's going to be coming up for a vote in the Assembly in the coming weeks. It's super critical moment, really important bill. We'll put some information about the bill in the chat. We'll also put a link to this form that we're showing you here, which is a really simple tool. If you live in California, please take 2 or 3 minutes and just look up your state assembly member primarily and put in a call, email, and track those contacts here on this form. Super impactful. Even a small number of calls can help move the needle. So please help us with that. And again, we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. And there's a join link in the chat to connect with OpenAir. As always, before we kick off the show, just want to define our terms. This is a definition of CDR from the CDR Primer, which is a great resource to get started learning about the sector. This is also essentially the same definition that's used by the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's sort of the global supranational definition of CDR. Purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. 2 really important things to call out up front every single time we talk about CDR. Number 1, it's not the same thing as quote unquote carbon capture or CCS, which is removing CO2 from a point source fossil carbon emissions like a cement plant. Carbon capture, CCS, may or may not be a good climate solution depending on the specific techno-economic circumstance, but it's a form of emissions reduction. It is not a form of carbon removal. So they are 2 different things. Number 2, really, whenever we talk about carbon removal, you have to call from the hills that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for a strong prioritization on decarbonizing the global economy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We need to do that as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. It's 90+% of our climate work. Carbon removal, the purpose of carbon removal is to balance out those residual emissions that we are not able to abate in the climate relevant timeframe. There's clear scientific consensus that that quantity is going to be billions of tons per year by mid-century that we're going to need to be removing from the atmosphere. So carbon removal is super important. We need to scale it. We're currently at kiloton scale. So we need to do a lot of work in the coming decades to scale carbon removal. And that's why we're here. We can't lose sight of the strong prioritization on reducing emissions. I am going to hand it over to my co-host and colleague, Megha Raghavan, who's going to talk a little bit about run of show and introduce today's session.
Hey everyone, I'm Megha. I am an OpenAir member based in London, and I work on policy and market development as well. I'm also Californian, so really excited about the California bill that Toby mentioned. So please check that out if you're in California. So as usual, we're going to start with a short presentation, and then we'll have a few prepared questions, which Toby will moderate, and then we will do moderated audience Q&A. So please type any of the questions that you have as we go into the Zoom Q&A box. It's separate from the chat box, so make sure you find the right one. It'll just help us to organize things a little better. We'll also be recording the event, so if you would like to see that recording later, we'll be sending it out to all of you if you registered, and we'll have it on OpenAir's YouTube channel and OpenAir's website. This week on This Is CDR, we're very pleased to welcome Eion Carbon co-founders CEO Adam Wolf and CTO Elliot Chang to discuss how the company seeks to drive innovation in the science, measurement, and operations of enhanced rock weathering in agriculture. Eion is a leader in enhanced rock weathering and patented the first direct measurement methodology to unlock this highly scalable removal pathway. Working with farmers and existing agricultural systems, their process of applying olivine to working lands rapidly, efficiently, and safely removes carbon while generating tangible environmental and social benefits. Adam Wolf is the co-founder and CEO of Eion. Prior to that, he founded and led the digital ag company Arable, and he holds a BSc and Msc in Agronomy from UC Davis, as well as a PhD in biology from Stanford, and he currently resides in Princeton, New Jersey. Elliot Chang is the co-founder and CTO of Eion, and he previously held researcher positions at LBL and LLNL, investigating metal-mineral interactions, and he holds a BSc from Princeton, as well as a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. His technology and innovation group is located in Oakland, California. So presenters, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Mega, thank you very much. I love this show, and I'm so happy to finally be here. Let me share my screen so that we can present. I know that you said that we're going to give a short presentation. This is actually the longest presentation I will have ever given about Eion, and I wanted to kind of dig into some of the technical details, knowing that you have an unusually educated audience. I started Eion, I guess it was only about 90 seconds after having the insight into starting the company that I called Elliot. And Elliot and I worked together when he was an undergrad and I was a postdoc here at Princeton. And we are both reformed academics, is fair to say. And when I think about this talk, what I thought you would want to hear about is really three things. One is the science of CDR as relates to enhanced rock weathering. Two is around the agronomics, how does this work in agricultural settings? And three is around health and safety. And if you tune out now, which you'd be forgiven to do if you see that we've got 44 slides to go through, there's really three takeaways. One is that it's measurable. Two is that it works for farmers, and three is that it's safe. But before diving into this, I thought I might give just a quick overview of what made us start this company and what makes us think that enhanced rock weathering is an important ingredient to decarbonization. This I adapted from Carbon Plan. You have a very similar scorecard from Stripe on all the kind of key metrics of what we're trying to achieve with high quality CDR. And, who doesn't like a test where you do great on every question, right? So I really loved enhanced rock weathering for being able to address this kind of top half, which is around, tell us about the science and like, how does it work for a carbon solution? And then on the bottom is really around, can this scale? Can this provide a meaningfully large chunk of the solution? And it doesn't take a genius to see that there's a pattern in this graph. Actually, we see all the big dots over here around DAC and bikers and BECs, with a lot of small dots over here for forest soils in particular. And then similarly around the this can it scale question, we get great scores for forests and soils, and kind of optimistically, we hope that these can have large capacity and falling costs. And we're not the only ones to have, uncovered this. So, there's like this trade-off where up here, you can easily have very expensive and low scale CDR. And we want affordable, high scale CDR. And I really had this insight. This came to me from Dialis. I'd been working with these questions. Is it real and can it scale? That's basically what that scorecard is going over. And he and his partner, John, had come up with this distinction between closed systems and open systems. And kind of what we both found ourselves thinking is that open systems can scale. And this contrast is that, unfortunately, open systems are notoriously hard to measure. And in closed systems, they're easy to measure, but they're hard to build. And our dream is that enhanced rock weathering can kind of square this circle. When we started Eion, ERW had this measurement problem. You know, on the left, this is a post from Dirk, and on the right from Dr. Hamann, Dr. Hartman, around like, gosh, ERW would be great if we could figure out how to measure it. And the kind of larger message of this presentation is that we think we unlocked the path to rigor for enhanced rock weathering. I don't want to say it's trivial to measure, but it fits within an existing system for collecting agricultural measurements. And so we can instrument this system and deliver certificated carbon removals. And it's not as easy to build for reasons that I'll tell you in a little bit, but Mother Nature does do most of the heavy lifting. And so it's a lot easier to build. And one of the reasons that we especially like enhanced rock weathering is around co-benefits, okay? So, Elliot, I'm going to pass you the mic to run through CDR Science, and I really want to contextualize this from this process map that Freya at Carbon Plan and Zeke at Stripe did a lot of effort to gather kind of community input and summarize. So this is kind of our departure point. Elliot.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. So what you're seeing here is the workflow in quantifying ultimately the CDR that takes place for the enhanced rock weathering process. And there are a variety of factors that play a role in this. And we won't be diving into each one of these in great detail, but we do want to point out two focal points for this topic, which is the weathering rates and the capture that can be quantified in the field, as well as this phenomenon called the strong acid loss effect, which would be considered an inefficiency in the enhanced rock weathering process. These are phenomena that have been, let's say, contentiously discussed in the past 2 years. And we believe there is a way to measure and quantify this in a relatively constrained manner. Adam, on the next slide. And so ultimately, for the weathering and capture, the way we think about this in simple terms is there's some amount of rock that is applied on the acre, and there's some amount of it that is ultimately weathered. So you can imagine there's a K weathered or a fraction weathered there. And of that amount of rock that has weathered, there is an inefficiency. There are a variety of pathways that could reduce the efficacy of enhanced rock weathering. And so those are quantified in rigorous manner that we'll get into in a moment. And so that leaves us with the final boss, which is what we desire, the carbon captured and removed from the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So this is how the carbon can be removed using enhanced rock weathering. And this is the schematic we often use at Eion. And it's basically showing you that the atmospheric CO2, shown in the yellow circle, ultimately dissolves into the soil. And as the rock is added, the rock magnesiums will pair up with your dissolved inorganic carbon or your bicarbonate oftentimes. And they will ultimately leach through the soil into waterways and ultimately persist for millennia in the ocean system. And so, that phenomena of leaching of bicarbonate can be described in a lot of different ways. We're showing you here a UC Berkeley column study it's a little complicated, but essentially on the right y-axis, you're looking at pH. And the blue triangles indicate over about a 60 or 80-day period that initially you have a pH decline in the leachate collected from the soil column. And that's because of ion exchange or releasing protons in exchange for base cations that bind to the soil complex. And then at a certain point at day 50, that pH increases in the leachate, and that's indicative of an alkalinity gain. And it turns out that alkalinity gain is correlated quite nicely with measured and projected bicarbonate. And the last thing I want to say about this slide is there is a delay in the measured bicarbonate, potentially due to anion exchange capacity in the soil. But the key takeaway is that the slope of the bicarbonate gain over time is consistent with what we would project from our measurement approach, our MRV, which is based on the cation budget. And so we can get into this more later, but it'll be a talk at Goldschmidt as well in July in Lyon. And Adam, if you want to move to the next slide. So one of the things that we really look carefully at is the estimation of weathering rate. And so you've seen this sort of schematic, but now let's imagine that as the rock is added, there are some elements that don't leach from the soil. There are some elements that actually persist in the topsoil. And those are what we call immobile trace elements, or ITEs in orange. And those persistent ITEs, we like to focus around rare earth elements, among other elements. But they do persist, and they allow us to track very nicely and within pretty good uncertainty how much rock is truly incorporated into the soil, and ultimately from there how much base cation was added into the system, as that determines later on the alkalinity flux. And so you can just, wrapping up these slides, you can see this is the budget that we use. So once you quantify how much magnesium was added, and the baseline, so that's that pre-magnesium amount at the bottom. If you also know the post amount, so the post-application, after harvest amount of magnesium persistent, you can quantify the amount of lost magnesium with the amount that flushed out of the soil. And so that is what we would quantify as like the alkalinity flux proxy that we're concerned about. So if we move on to the next slide, these are a couple of equations that we've used to formulate. So these are calculations. I mean, you can call them models, but they're calculations in which we use, importantly, application rate. And so while many might assume an application rate from applied maps, we actually quantify it through using our immobile trace elements. And so Adam, if you go to the periodic table, you'll see that we've highlighted a couple of elements that work quite nicely as ITEs. So certainly on the left-hand side, the +1, +2 valence elements are not particularly sticky in the soil. However, titanium and the lanthanides at the bottom can function in certain circumstances as very nice ITEs that allow us to recover application rates and then start our MRV process. This figure here is a figure that is in a manuscript going through peer review with UIUC and the Leverhulme Center. What you're looking at is let's focus just on the left panel, the A panel. For a maize soy system that received a Blue Ridge Meta basalt from 2016 to 2020, we can actually determine, based on the change in rare earths, you can determine the application rate based on the slope of the change in the soil of the rare earth as a function of, on the X, the concentration of rare earth in the rock. And so what we see is that we forensically determined about 20.20 kilograms per meter squared of rock applied to this maize plot. And it turns out that Illinois applied about 20 kilograms per meter squared. So very good error around that. And that's really because we get to use a lot of these different geotracers to our advantage. And Adam, if you move on to the next slide, this is a simple equation in which we can calculate the weathered amount of that rock is just basically the total amount of magnesium flushing out of the soil. So that accounts for removal of any secondary minerals forming in the topsoil that won't leach out. So we only quantify what has left the topsoil, and then divide that by the total amount that we quantify as added. And it turns out that in our work with Stripe, it turns out that 50% of the rock did dissolve and has left, the weathering products have left the topsoil in about 6 months for Illinois and Mississippi. And of that 50%, about 93% of that leach-based cation we consider as flushing into waterways and participating in permanent CDR. Keeping in mind that this material was quite fine, D50 of about 90 microns. It was an acidic soil as well. But we're really happy to see and quantify and measure across the acres about 50% dissolving. So of that amount that has dissolved, there's a component that needs to be accounted for, which is again, this concept around strong acid loss. That can be accounted for by field trials. So we have a variety of field trials in Michigan and Illinois, looking at basically conducting block replicated trials with different crops, working with different professional analytical labs that can evaluate using ion chromatography and mass spectrometry how much elements, so cations and anions that are quantified in the solid soil, as well as that in the liquid phase, so that's in lysimeters. And so we don't have to spend too much time on the next two, but basically we have replication of different trials that have lysimeters installed. And also you're seeing here just the timeline in which there's a baseline pre-application and post-application. And after post-application, at the post-harvest, we open up the lysimeter and we analyze them for nitrate concentration, among other things, such as phosphate and sulfate. What you're seeing in this bar plot for corn and soy is within this magnesium loss, so the magnesium that flushes out of the soil, the component taken up by plants that we measure is only a small fraction, and specifically around strong acids, they're even a smaller portion of that. And so this is really practice dependent, but within the work that we've seen, the nitrate effect is quite low, around 2%, if not lower in certain instances. And this is also consistent with what we've seen in our peer review or work with UIUC that is going through the peer review process. And so lastly, I just say, I know we've kind of zoomed through this, but I wanted to make a point that we're working on white papers to disseminate this work and a methodology. We're actually working on an ISO-compliant methodology with a variety of different groups to get that verified, as well as a Stripe report here, which ultimately, hopefully, will see the day of light to a broader audience. But ultimately, the take home is that ERW CDR MRV can be operationalized, and this process can be measured with quantifiable uncertainty. Adam, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just want to do a plug for there's a group of scientists of different ERW companies that Elliot has brought together that spent a lot of time discussing these types of things. So if that is within your interest, I encourage you to reach out to Elliot to join that conversation. I'm actually a bona fide agronomist, so I'm the agronomist on the team. I know I often give this talk like, what we're doing is Fred Flintstone level work. Like it can't not go wrong. For this talk, I want to say you can go wrong. There's actually some subtleties around this because we're working in farmer fields and we need to attest to what this is going to do in their fields. And so what we focus on is this premise of silicates as an ag lime substitute. So there's a history of the use of silicates that dates back, over a century. So it's not outrageous to think that, things other than calcium carbonate can be an ag lime, but it is some novelty there. And a lot of this can be summarized in terms of just understanding the calcium oxide, magnesium oxide. We see calcium silicate like welastenite has a decent CCE. We see forsterite has an excellent CCE. Basalt also has a CCE. So all of these have some alkalizing potential. There's also within the agronomic literature this notion of a fineness factor. Okay, so usually an ag lime will be sifted through various meshes, and those meshes dissolve at certain rates. So some are available in the first year and some are available later. So this is running about 150 different ag limes from an Illinois lime producers survey. So you can see that there's quite a range of variation in how quickly those dissolve. But these X's highlight what a farmer's expecting, okay? That is like the median for Illinois. We know different geographies vary. And so we see our challenge is engineering a product to perform better as an ag lime. And this is based around an engineered material. So we get to decide what the particle size distribution is. We can run each of these size classes independently for their dissolution and more or less predict how this is going to behave in the field, not differently than the Illinois agronomic handbook makes recommendations for how to use standard ag limes in fields. And so our approach to this is really, as much as we want the carbon to be removed predictably, we really want this to behave in a sensible way once it lands in the field. And the takeaway here is that this actually goes to completion much quicker than a standard ag lime, and in some ways can be considered a precision ag product. My last area here that I wanted to talk about is around health and safety. And I think there's some essential context within the ERW space that has been missing on this topic. Olivine in particular has been used as an ag input for decades. It's listed for sale in the US, in Brazil, in New Zealand, in Australia. 2 million tons of serpentine have been applied in New Zealand since the 40s. And so this has all happened without any apparent ill consequence. But then we're contemplating not just, 2 million tons over some decades, we're contemplating, gigatons. And so there's a sensible approach here that says, okay, well, if this is so good, what's it going to be like if we take it to its logical scale? And so for us, we went to this resource that was developed by the EPA when trying to interpret what the various exposure pathways were for municipal solid waste to be applied to croplands, to forests. Some of these are relevant to organics. That's not the case for silicate rocks. And so only these paths in red are relevant to us. So there's 14 different pathways. Fortunately, in this technical support document, you can have every equation, every parameter, and all the data used to develop the regulations in this 2,000 pages of report. And if you walked away with one takeaway here, it's that there's no apparent risk to applying silicate rocks at scale. And I'm going to give you a flavor for why that is. So paths 12 and 14 are those paths that are the loss pathways. So how do metals and nickel in particular leave the system? Here, different metals behave differently. Essentially, not even 1% of the metals leave by surface runoff, and so this is really given no consideration by the EPA as a cause for concern. They analyzed the groundwater pathway, and based on this partition factor that they use. This came out of the Netherlands. The accumulation of metals cannot exceed a number of ppm. And so in particular, as we think about soil thresholds, in the US, most soils are 15 ppm and less. It cannot accumulate very high. And this is helpful context for when we try to understand what are the pathways for things like, could this end up in the foods that we eat? This is pathways 1 and 2, where it follows through this application. Ultimately, we put it in the soil, it ends up in the crop, and humans eat that product. Humans have a background intake, in this case of nickel, but bear in mind we could do this for any number of different constituents. And the intake is around 7,000 times what that background amount is. So we don't get very much. And that's related to the retention and non-bioaccumulation of nickels in the ecosystem. We can understand what the cumulative application rate is, this RPC, based on taking that relative uptake and dividing it by our dietary consumption. And here, the EPA gathered a lot of data to understand what is the accumulation of nickel, in this case, into various of the foods that we eat. And then we can multiply that out by our dietary consumption. And then the fraction of the land that we put, in this case, olivine on. So this first column, it's applied to 2.5% of all land. The second one is kind of the case that we're a bit more interested in, though. This is for a home gardener that substantially applies olivine, in this case, to all of their land. And so they end up with closer to 60% of all the foods that they eat. And we reach a result that it would take, in the first case, 30,000 years of continuous application to lead to a harmful consequence, or for the home gardener, 2,500 years of continuous application to reach a harmful effect. And I just want to contextualize this with the initial graph that I showed you, illustrating that it does not accumulate in the soil. It reaches a steady state after about 100 to 200 years. And so we end up with this non-feasible solution that it cannot cause harm. I can share with you more about this analysis, but I really want to underscore that through all of these pathways, no risks are apparent. And to my knowledge, no one has ever surfaced an actual harm taking place. There's an important asterisk here, though, that we are in agriculture and standard agricultural safety precautions apply. That's true for all ag inputs, and rock dust in this case is no exception. I want to close with really this understanding of a path to scale. And for here, I think it's helpful to understand, we're leveraging the abundance of agricultural land in the world, which means that we're really relying on agricultural communities to play a significant role in decarbonizing our economy and in essentially this long-term effort to remove the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And one of the most powerful things that aligns Eion with many of our peers in the space, I would say all of our peers, is that we're very motivated around being able to use carbon and the sort of interest in, let's say, the revenue models enabled by it back into rural landscapes And at the center of this, there's a farmer, but the entire supply chain, in some cases, the rock quarries are in the countryside, the pulverizer, in our case, we're developing in Vicksburg, Mississippi. There's a retailer who is a middleman for ag inputs, and they often employ the agronomists that are giving advice to the farmers. There's a truck driver that is bringing all this dust to the field. There's an applicator who's applying this lime substitute. Ultimately, the farmer is benefiting from the agronomic value, but also the commodity value of making a net zero crop. And ultimately, we employ people in the areas that we work in as a company. So we are here as this project developer. All of this, I think, is a really powerful way to rewrite a lot of the 20th century depopulation of rural America and imagine a rural vitality that is consistent with our values and our vision for, you know, the country we want to live in. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. I went through a lot of information, and I'm sure some questions have accumulated.
Yes, that was fantastic. Thanks to you both for such an in-depth presentation. And I know the audience appreciates this as well. And as usual, I'm going to ask a few questions, and then audience, also Adam and Elliot will be able to stay maybe a few minutes after the top of the hour since the presentation was a bit long. So we're going to get to as many audience questions as possible. I have 3 or 4 that I'd like to ask though. I guess my first question, just I'm going to cut to the chase. I think that, and I ask this question as a big fan of enhanced weathering and someone who thinks that we should be trying to advance a range of CDR pathways as quickly as possible. I've observed kind of a dynamic out there, and it's illustrated in a post that you participated in on the old CDR Google group that maybe Chris Neidl can put in the chat, that practitioners of enhanced weathering, and this applies to other pathways as well, particularly open system pathways, feel like questions are largely answered and we're ready to scale. It works, it's measurable, it's safe. I think that empirically, because I've observed it, there's not unanimous agreement to those 3 assertions out there. And you had a good answer, I thought, to assertion basically that we don't know that it works in the CDR Google group exchange, but maybe just can you speak to that a little bit and how, as a practitioner, because you're a commercial enterprise, you want to move as quickly as possible, you're also doing this because you care about climate and you want to do good. So I think that one thing that we should all do is kind of not doubt anyone's intentions, but how do you plan to go about convincing people that don't agree with the assertions that it works, it's measurable, it's safe?
I don't know. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and in some ways, I'm trying to get stronger by lifting weights. And anybody can say like, well, I lifted the weights, how come I'm not stronger? And your trainer can say, well, like, how often did you do it? Did you get sleep afterwards? Were you drinking protein shakes? Did you remember to stretch? Are you injured? There's a lot of reasons why something cannot work, but certain things have to line up for it to work. And speaking here as an agronomist, and I really want to highlight David Bierling's work for sort of setting the essential template for me for understanding the key drivers. I believe that if you have a fine-sized material that has a sufficient alkalizing potential, and you put it into a warm, wet, and acidic place, then it's going to do its job. And there's the potential that if you add too much, it becomes too alkalizing and actually shuts off the acidity. If you put it on too coarse, it's not going to dissolve at the rate that you think. If you put it into a cold, dry place, it's not going to work. For us, we're working with a mineral called olivine. Olivine is blessed with a number of favorable attributes. One of them is that it's, as a crystal structure, easily dissolved. In fact, I believe it's the most easily dissolved of the various silicate minerals in this category. And we're using a material that is unusually fine, right? So this is like under 100 microns, and we're putting it into soils that are unusually weathered. So this is in the southern United States. You have ultisols, oxasols, pH 5, low cation exchange, all the conditions where it works. And what Elliot showed you is that it worked. So we approached this from figuring out where is it going to work and putting it out in the world and learning that it worked as planned. I believe that to the extent people have had different results, one or more of the essential ingredients must not be working.
And so as we figure these things out, I think the peer review paper helps a lot if you are, to an extent that you're collaborating on your MRV and methodology and having that peer reviewed maybe informally by others and sharing that publicly. I think that helps a lot. But I think one sticking point remains. There is uncertainty, even if you are certain, and you are out selling carbon credits, and carbon credits and carbon markets are going to fund the scaling of these uncertain open system pathways. And this is how do you look at that dynamic? Like how we're selling carbon credits to, I think it works, but not everyone thinks it works. And we're selling carbon credits. How do you resolve that in your mind? How do you think about that?
I mean, you're talking to an agronomist who later got a PhD in ecology. And, in a lot of my fields, if we got an R squared of 0.4, it's considered publishable. All right. So nature is messy. And, I think of this with, making, recommendations for different seeds. There's a genetic component, there's an environmental component, there's a management component, and what you get at the end of the season is, it's very hard to predict. And there's a lot of moving parts. We don't have genetics, but we've got a feedstock that has, particular mineral attributes, and it's going to vary. What I think is really compelling, if you recall the plots that Elliot showed, the R squared, being able to go back into that spot and recover the amount of rock that we put on was 95% in one case and 99% in another case, right? So here, let's take a system that routinely we have low R squared and find that there's actually an unusually precise way to forensically determine what happened there. And for me, that's, there's a lot of sources of messiness in the world, and we go after the one thing that we know is going to have the most uncertainty, which is the rates of weathering, and try to hit the bullseye. And so that's what our focus is quite targeted.
Got it. Switching gears a bit, I think, all practitioners of enhanced weathering are talk about the benefits to the farmers. I get the local supply chain, quarries, et cetera. Can we speak specifically about the farmer? Are they, what is the benefit to the farmer? Are they getting free lime? Are they participating in the carbon credit revenue? Like specifically, if the farmers are the ones who are actually operationalizing the carbon removal, like how do they participate commercially in this activity?
It's no secret that carbon pays for the party, right? So there's a good reason using silicate rocks as an ag lime substitute historically, which is that it's too expensive. Okay, it's used commercially as a magnesium input. You can find parts of Pennsylvania where slags are used. So in certain locales, you find silicates being used, but it's not widespread. Why is that? It's too expensive. And so this is where the kind of unique economy enabled by carbon allows for the economics to work. I do believe, though, I mean, we can observe how the soil organic carbon market grew, which is that it didn't, to wonder, gosh, I wonder if the incentives around, participating in carbon markets are sufficient. And I like to remind myself that farmers make a living farming. And our focus is really on creating a superior input. So olivine is superior to ag lime as far as its alkalizing potential per acre. And it has other benefits in terms of nutrient interactions and whatnot. But I want the farmer to get the benefit from this, principally agronomically. And in the work that we've done in Mississippi, the farmer that deployed carbon lock last year, this wasn't a replicated field trial. This is like operationally removing carbon. They had a 10 bushel per acre increase in soybean yield. Soybeans command about a $12 a bushel price, or at least for his contract. So that was $120 an acre. And you could picture that, a lot of ag inputs, they want to have a benefit that is, some multiple of what it costs. So let's say if it's $20 or $40 in to get $120 out. And so this is really our area, is achieving a value proposition. Let's call it the old-fashioned way.
But is the farmer paying for the feed, the olivine or the lime substitute, or are they getting it for free? And are they getting any carbon credit revenue?
As I said, the carbon pays for the party. It costs us more than we get from the farmer. Does that make sense?
So the farmer's paying for the material, and then the carbon is subsidizing your ability to deliver the material.
Correct. And in our locales, I know the abundance of ag lime varies greatly across the U.S.
Yep.
In the South and Southeast, it runs anywhere from $40 to $80 a ton applied. And so to the extent that this could be applied for, let's say, $20, $25 a ton, that's considered a significant value proposition, because otherwise that material is simply not available. And so if you can think of this as a yield gap issue, there are many acres that could benefit from the application of ag lime that cannot afford it right now. And so this is what we see as kind of one of the larger opportunities, is that there's ways to achieve superior margins on the farm through this subsidy enabled by the carbon market.
One quick last question for me, and then would love to get to the audience questions, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. And again, please put those in the Zoom Q&A box so we can manage them. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about your and the enhanced weathering sector's relationship with the mining sector? It sounds like maybe you're working for now with maybe smaller quarries and sources of material and feedstock, but you have a large mining company friend, and large mining companies have an opportunity to potentially participate in this. Like, how do you see that working? And how do you think about that relationship with the mining sector?
Yeah, no, we have spent a lot of time with a company called Sibelco. Sibelco is the largest industrial minerals company in Europe. They're based in Belgium, so they're acutely aware of environmental dimensions of what they do. And they've operated for 150 years. And so long-term sustainability is really kind of defines their existence. A lot of the work that they've done is really around circular economy. So taking in, for example, fiber optic cables, reprocessing them and turning them into new glass products. And so a lot of what they're doing already is in this realm of resource efficiency, circular economy. Decarbonization ends up being a really powerful lens. I don't think anybody asked them to be the world expert in olivine, but they happen to acquire a quarry in Norway. This has been around since the 40s and was developed in a town called Oheim to serve the Norwegian steel industry. That particular quarry put out of business every American olivine quarry. And the reason is because they operate on hydropower, so it has extremely low emissions, and it sits on a fjord. And so it's extremely cost effective. And so we've found that actually it's unusual for a startup to work with a strategic so early in its lifetime, and yet where is the talent, like the expertise that exists to enable us to actually contemplate meeting this even at megaton, let alone gigaton scale, is with people that already have that expertise and have the, call it the mission alignment to see it through. And so I can't speak to other mining companies, but I feel very fortunate with this engagement. And I think other enhanced rock weathering companies can speak to the same engagement.
Yeah, and the mining companies notionally could do this themselves, and they notionally have the mineralogical and subsurface geology expertise. They think they can do the MRV maybe. How do you see how does a enhanced weathering startup fit in, or how does Eion fit in this scenario? And I'm going to put a link to a kind of an interesting blog I thought from Peter Olivier from Undo about this issue and how maybe how enhanced weathering companies ultimately can be sort of MRV service providers for large mining companies and other large companies as they look to decarbonize from a insetting perspective.
I think we can think about this more generally as there exists old industries, and my last company was in ag tech. Ag is an old industry. Mining is an old industry. Up the street from me is a gravel quarry that dates from George Washington's time. It's old industry. Rail is old. Barge is old. There's a lot of kind of a way that things are done that doesn't lead to massive innovation if it's not required. And so what we see is an opportunity to create a model of excellence. And the model of excellence is around rigor in measurement. It's around environmental stewardship. It's around environmental justice, engaging with the communities that we're in. And if it succeeds, then ultimately partnering with strategics is going to be the way to take it to its logical scale. Because in my mind, we're going to be doing this for a couple hundred years, right? If we're going to clean 1 trillion tons out of the atmosphere. And so we have to start off creating an industry that can be that ubiquitous.
I'm going to walk one thing back that you said, that large mining companies can't innovate, because I do think there are some examples of large mining companies who have innovated. I think they're large, they move slowly, and it's difficult for them to do things laterally across their large operations. But just because we do have some mining company people in the audience.
No, I don't want to pretend that they don't innovate. I just want to say that there's some aspects of how the world works as relates to, let's say, ESG. Sure, a lot of people would say well, I don't know what it is, but I know I'm supposed to do it. And in the same way, like CDR, I see that there's an opportunity I don't necessarily know what this rule book is about. And so there's various aspects of how the economy is transitioning that naturally takes, an innovator, not to put that hat on myself, but to sort of flesh out what the opportunity is. And absolutely, we expect that is going to sort of take root once you show it. I think it's the example that was given to me is, Ben Franklin put out a street light, and then people said, I want that. He didn't throw around saying people ought to be like lighting up the street.
Agreed. Well, listen, thank you so much for bearing with me with these questions. And we have a bunch from the audience. And again, Adam and Elliot have graciously been able to stay for another 5 or 10 minutes. So we're going to get to as many as we can, and we'll close no later than 10 minutes after the hour. But thanks, Adam and Elliot.
Yeah, would one of you like to read them?
I'll go ahead and read out a couple of questions, and then you guys, whichever of you wants to answer, can go ahead. I think we've got a few questions on sort of how this works across different conditions. So different project sites, operators, soil conditions. How do you kind of operationalize this and make sure that it's consistent the way you monitor and sort of enforce quality standards?
There's a couple different aspects of this, and I'm going to take the first part and hand it to Elliot for the second part. The first part comes in the last decade. There's been a massive leap in digital agriculture, to the extent that it is not unusual at all to find that agronomists in essentially every county and locale have tools to set field boundaries, to track inputs, and to take gridded geolocated soil samples. And so there's a whole infrastructure in place to be able to collect the samples. The other part is around, we're measuring elements that I can't even list them off. Yttrium, europium, neodymium, those are Elliot's domain. And he developed a means to make use of commodity equipment that is present in a wide number of locales. This is like not different from the people who are processing agronomic samples to be able to produce this data. And we think this is just an essential aspect of, like, you don't want Adam running the ICP. We like to work with the trained professionals. Elliot, could you speak more to how this is unfolded?
Yeah, absolutely. So, taking a one step back here, we need to, to address the fact that how we operationalize ERW will focus around a methodology and a protocol. And this is something that Eion and other organizations have been pursuing quite actively, with those Undo, Implanted, those many others now. We are all trying to build consensus around a methodology, and within a methodology is also housed a project design document, and that is how one would execute in a certain locale, a certain geoclimatic zone. And for us, we like to use these rare earth elements and other geotracers that can be analyzed on different analytical tools, and that's baked in to the project design document, which is housed by the methodology. And the last thing I'll say here is, yes, there might seem like there's fragmentation amongst ERW companies and practitioners. However, we've been working really hard, like very, very hard, in drawing some form of consensus within the 7 to 8 organizations. I created this international enhanced rock weathering working group. It's a science and industry working group. So any scientist who is working in industry, I'm giving a plug. Anyone who wants to join that, please reach out to me. But we are essentially just bringing together the scientists who are now practitioners in industry, and like all the head of science CTOs, we're just all talking. And I actually think that there's more agreement than what is perceived. We understand geochemistry in very similar ways. And as Adam pointed out earlier in his in the beginning, that like how you actually execute the trials may differ. They may differ in pH initial or a variety of different mineralogy in the soil. But we're even looking at like how do we design food trials in a similar manner that other groups can execute in a common fashion so that we all get results that are at least apples to apples comparable. So that's how we would operationalize the MRV component of ERW.
Okay, got it. And I guess just following on to that, a few people did ask about that sort of consensus building and making sure that there's not fragmentation. How much has that sort of tied in with what governments or policymakers are starting to think about when they set standards? Are they kind of listening to the industry groups, or are those being developed in parallel and separately?
At best, they've heard of it.
Okay.
And this is an area where Sebastian Manhart of Carbon Future has done a really incredible job, and Berta as well from Carbon Future, around orienting a set of industry project developers. And I think it helps that there's some kind of rough terrain that was traversed by the biochar industry. And they had to go through the same piece around developing a standard methodology, developing the body of evidence around what the agronomic benefits were, and then gaining the visibility of policymakers to see that this, plays some role in the solution. Biochar, I want to say, has been around for like decades, and enhanced rock weathering, certainly terrestrial, has not. And so this is an area that we all need to work together to be able to, elevate the awareness of what this can play in, working lands in all of our prospective, countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. We had another question just about sort of getting to scale, and thinking about the fact that you have a few large farms in the world, but then a long tail of much smaller family farms. How do you think about the pathway to scaling quickly? Is it about hitting the larger farms first or smaller, and does that affect how your approach works or how well it works?
So this is, for me, like one of the saddest experiences I had as an entrepreneur is, I started a company before and we made a thing and we thought it did well. And inevitably we end up working with the largest, companies in the world and the largest farmers in the world. And, we buy our groceries from, a farm down the street. And it felt kind of crummy that like, oh no, you don't want our product. This is like not going to be helpful for you. It costs too much for you. And it seems like, well, that sucks to be making something and yet it doesn't serve my neighbors. And what I like about enhanced rock weathering is it works for everybody. Like it rains on the just and unjust. Like acid soils happen to all kinds of people, be they large farmers and small farmers. And our approach to this is really, you quickly go bankrupt if you go door to door selling in agriculture. So by working with the ag distributors, like the crop consultants and those people that provide services, they touch all those farmers, and they can touch the large and the small without preference. And this is, I think, has one of the most powerful levers for good, is to be able to improve profitability for small farmers so that they can keep their land against what's obviously a tide of consolidation that has happened for the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, definitely. And does it work well with other kind of soil carbon management methods like no-till or or other sort of ag carbon management programs, or have you looked into that at all?
Well, it's one of the great ironies of soil carbon programs that the people that are most bought in are excluded. So if you've already been no-till, sorry. If you've already been using cover crops, sorry. And so there's like a tremendous level of, I don't know, grumbling. Like, isn't that crummy that, you know, the people who really created the opportunity for this to be a carbon solution don't get to participate? And this is where rock weathering, it can be layered on top of no-till. It can be layered on top of cover crops, but you can be like antagonistic to no-till. It doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work in all locales. So it doesn't require any particular program to align with. Works in forests, works in pastures. You know, I like the kind of egalitarianism of it. I mean, certainly the agronomics matter, but otherwise, you know, I think the stackability is one of its most potent attributes.
Great. Yeah. I'm just going to do a couple more before we go. So we had a couple on things, just kind of the logistics of it. So what was the application rate that you would use per hectare? And then at the end of it, what is the net effect on soil, organic and inorganic carbon that comes out at the end?
Great question. Everybody, the insider question is application rate. So we defer to soil tests. So based on your soil pH, buffer pH, and crop management objectives. So could be that your soil pH is 5.5, your target is 6.5, you have a buffer of like 6.2 something. All this gives you a lime requirement. And so we have a calculator that, you know, is consistent with what every agronomic lab in the country would give you that says how much lime you would put on. Those same slides that I shared with you that included the calcium carbonate equivalent, those tell you, based on your CCE, how much of any particular product you should put on. And it accounts for this fineness factor. In the end, we end up with around 2 tons per acre, American tons, or imperial tons, I forget. They don't use them in the empire. So
yeah, exactly.
But our experimental trials, our original work was 0 to 8, 32. We wanted tons per hectare. We wanted to get a really wide span. But, you know, those are non-agronomic. And so the work that Elliot presented, we do 0, 1, 3, 6. And a lot of our work focuses on that 3 tons. And these are short tons per acre, just so that we can talk about them in America. If you want to learn more about rate trials, reach out. We're actively doing more of them, and be great to be able to get more results in more locales.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for joining us and for staying a bit longer. This has been really great. And Toby, over to you for what's coming next.
Since we are late, very briefly, yeah, thank you both so much. That was fantastic. Really appreciate you being with us and learned a lot, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
I'm just going to share a screen really quick and what we have upcoming. Bunch of things. Another soil carbon presenter next week, Andes, which is a microbial soil carbon company. And I won't read the list, but there's the other ones. And there should be a link in the chat too, where you can sign up for all of these. And looking forward to Andes next week. Thank you again to Adam and Elliot from Eion. And thank you to the audience who stayed with us, and be well, and we'll see you next week.